With Kobe Bryant's number 8 and number 24 jerseys taking their rightful place in the rafters of the Staples Center this week, it seems like a good time to talk about an old game that I've wanted to cover in greater detail for some time, Kobe Bryant in NBA Courtside. Developed by Left Field Productions and released exclusively on the Nintendo 64 in 1998, NBA Courtside spawned a couple of sequels and made Kobe Bryant the youngest player to have an NBA video game in his namesake, but it ultimately failed to take off as a series. It is a game worth reflecting upon though, so let's take a closer look. Coming out in the latter half of the 1998 season, Kobe Bryant and NBA Courtside features rosters updated as of the trade deadline. As was the case with all NBA video games at the time, Michael Jordan is absent, replaced by a roster player wearing number 98. Latrell Sprewell is also missing, owing to his suspension following his infamous altercation with then Warriors coach PJ Carlesimo. Charles Barkley does appear in the game however, as he did in NBA Live 98 and other 98 season titles. Speaking of the rosters, they're limited to 12 players per team, in contrast to other video games that feature the full 15 roster spots. It's possible to edit the rosters by making trades, releasing and signing players, and changing the starting lineups. Edit Player is in fact the Create a Player function, with 20 slots available for custom players. Unfortunately, there's a very limited amount of faces available for created players, and you can't modify original players. A couple more notes about the rosters before we talk about the game itself. Despite still being a bench player at that point in his career, Kobe is the default starting point guard for the Lakers ahead of Nick Van Exel and Derek Fisher, the players who actually split duties starting alongside Eddie Jones in the backcourt. Presumably, Left Field didn't want the face of their game to be coming off the bench, as he wouldn't be immediately playable out of the box. Another interesting quirk is that unlike most basketball games, player ratings are completely hidden. The rumour has always been that this was done because Kobe himself had a hand in rating the players, thus their attributes were hidden to avoid causing controversy and offence. This rumour has never been officially confirmed, as far as I'm aware, and while Kobe may have offered up some suggestions for prominent players, it seems highly unlikely that he would have had time to make detailed suggestions for over 300 of his peers. Considering that the game is rather thin on statistics and the like to begin with, it could just as easily be a design choice. Okay, enough backstory and roster trivia. Let's take a look at the game itself. One of the first things you'll notice is that the graphics haven't aged particularly well. This is generally the case with a lot of games released early on in the 3D era, and a lot of Nintendo 64 titles in particular have aged badly. At the time, of course, NBA Courtside's faces, models, and animations were at least satisfactory, though not quite as good as its contemporaries on PC and PlayStation. The controls are relatively deep. In addition to the basic shooting and passing controls, there are buttons for crossovers and special moves, play calling, icon passing, intentional fouls, and calling for picks. It's another one of those basketball games that uses a button other than pass to switch control and defense though, and I've never been a fan of that particular design choice. The Nintendo 64's controller also doesn't lend itself particularly well to the depth and complexity of the controls. Don't get me wrong, I was a Nintendo fanboy growing up and I have a lot of nostalgia for the N64, but its controller wasn't always suitable for sports games, especially sim titles. In terms of AI and the general gameplay experience, NBA Courtside is pretty standard for sim games of the time. In other words, it's far more realistic than titles like NBA Hang Time, but there's still more video game tactics involved rather than actual basketball strategy. It also has some of its own quirks and issues. For example, it's very easy for the CPU to force you to pick up your dribble, stopping your player in their tracks upon the slightest collision with a defender. Conversely, the CPU is able to keep its dribble far more often on collisions. Players catching the ball in the post can also be pushed backwards very easily, resulting in them walking without a travelling call. Icon passing is a bit clunky, as you need to tap R and Z simultaneously in order to enable and disable the functionality. The CPU calls plays, but its shot distribution is a little unrealistic. All players use the same special dribbling moves, including bigs. With that being said, there were some innovative elements. An X marked the spot for where a rebound was likely to bounce, though a lot of boards were flat-footed, almost all shots rattled on the rim, and the X indicator also kind of telegraphed made shots. The pass to post button doubled as an alley-oop control, though it was rare to get players open enough to try for a lob. And then there's the sprint meter, which was used quite effectively. In addition to limiting a player's ability to continually sprint, players must have ample sprint in order to perform special moves and attempt steals, meaning that steals and fancy dribbling moves can't be spammed indefinitely. Play calling is reasonably sophisticated for a game released in 1998, though overall, gameplay is not quite as realistic and polished as other titles. It's hardly vastly inferior to games like NBA Live 98 though, and you could certainly appreciate the more innovative features while having a generally fun experience. It's also one of the few basketball games, if not the only one, that allowed you to be assessed a technical for hanging on the rim after a dunk. This was achieved by continuing to hold the shoot button, hang around long enough, and you'd be teed up. Not necessarily a winning strategy, of course, but still enjoyable to do all the same. Speaking of fun things to do, there was also some special teams, made up of developers, which could be accessed by holding down L when selecting the preseason, season or playoffs options in the main menu. In-game, you could punch in codes to access a disco court and enable big head mode. Codes and Easter eggs like that are definitely a relic of their era, as sim games have shied away from sillier content in favour of historical teams and other such bonus features. That's not a bad thing, of course, but secrets like that do hold a certain nostalgic value. As I mentioned, there is a season and playoffs mode, but they're very simple and bare bones. You can only play one season at a time, and it's kind of clunky. Accessing the stats screen takes you back to the main menu, and there's no in-season trades function. You have to mess around with the default rosters to change lineups in the ongoing season. It's actually quite primitive for a basketball game released in 1998, lacking the depth of sim games that had been released years earlier. Although there would be 2 further NBA Courtside games, the second of which was compared quite favourably to its competition, the series ultimately failed after its lone GameCube release. Much like NBA Inside Drive on the Xbox, being exclusive to a console likely didn't do NBA Courtside any favours. With a more limited release, it was difficult to challenge the established multi-platform brand of NBA Live, not to mention the rising star of NBA 2K. It likely also didn't help that Nintendo was starting to gain a reputation as the kiddie console, with sports gamers generally gravitating towards the PlayStation 2 or Xbox, or indeed, opting for the PC. All things considered, the first NBA Courtside title wasn't quite on par with other games released during the 1998 season. I certainly played it far less than NBA Live, but even so, I did find myself drawn to it. I could definitely appreciate some of the concepts it introduced, some of which are still utilised in some capacity in video games today. It remains noteworthy because of its association with Kobe Bryant and of course the rumours that surrounded it. However, the shallow season mode aside, it is a solid release in its own right. In terms of basketball video games, NBA Courtside may not rank up there the same way Kobe Bryant sits among the NBA's all-time greats, but by making him the face of the game, Left Field accurately pegged him as a future Hall of Famer. At the very least, it's a reminder of a time when more than just a couple of developers were making sim basketball titles, and everyone was coming up with a few good ideas here and there. Like Kobe Bryant himself, basketball video games would get a lot better, but there were unquestionably early flashes of brilliance that impressed us. In that regard, NBA Courtside stands as a great metaphor for a young Mamba.